Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, it was a pretty exhausting week, as I kind of alluded to in last week's intro. The thing was, my dad's wife was in the hospital from Saturday to Saturday, which meant I had to take care of errands for her, make sure Dad didn't fall or die while he was alone, and still find time for my job and my art craziness, whatever you want to call the podcast, newsletter, all the other stuff I do. But we got her home Saturday evening, which meant I could take a breath, I guess. But then I dived into today's insanity. It is around 5:15 p.m. while I'm recording this. Today included a 30-minute virtual presentation for a client's conference, which I delivered while sitting in my car in the parking lot of my oncology clinic where I was stealing Wi-Fi. Then I got an email from congressional staff to set up a call today while I was in the lobby of the oncology clinic. I eventually had my quarterly check-in with the oncologist, and that turned out just fine. My numbers are good. I still don't need to start treatment for my leukemia. They might want to start me on IgG infusions this fall, but otherwise, it was not bad news by any stretch of imagination. Except for the fact that I was supposed to be on another client's event from 11 to 1, and the oncology clinic was packed this day, so I didn't get out of there till 11:15, had emailed the client. I wasn't supposed to present. I was just going to be doing commentary on somebody else's presentation. Told them I will log in at 11:30 when I walk in the door. Did so. Burned some barns with that because I had plenty to say about the stuff that they were speaking on. And then a 45-minute meeting with another trade group about an FDA negotiation we're going to be part of this fall. And then the call with the congressional staffers, where I did a little too good of a job explaining my industry and pharmaceutical supply chains and other stuff. And I wound up kind of sort of getting invited to testify in front of a congressional subcommittee next week for a hearing. So the show was a little late today is what I'm saying. I should have known the day was going to be weird. I mean, I knew it would be weird because I had the oncology check-in today, but the smoke and carbon monoxide alarm went off at 2:30 this morning asking for new batteries. So things did not start off on a good note. But hey, man, my cancer is still stage 0. I don't need treatment. My clients all seem to like me still. And you might see me on C-SPAN next week. So it's always good to have something to stress over, you know? But with all that out of the way, let's get to this week's show. My guest this time is, I was going to say Peter Stothard. He's actually Sir Peter Stothard, which I never called him at any point during our conversation. But Peter Stothard, he has a wonderful new book out now from Yale University Press, Horace, Poet on a Volcano. It's a biography of the Roman poet Horace, who is best known for his odes, the verse epistle Ars Poetica, and the Carmen Seculare. Peter's a classicist who he was on the show back in 2022 for his biography of the Roman general Crassus, and I got to do that one at his home in England, which was one of the most wonderful experiences I have had. The podcast was good, but we just had a really good time together afterwards, taking a boat along the river outside his place. And anyway, my thing is, Peter's got I'll just say in-depth, which is saying it lightly, knowledge of of those times, and his way of bringing those figures in history to life is just phenomenal. I mean, Rome has a lot to teach us about our present day, which I learned once I finally started reading Roman history, which I talk about during this episode. But Peter is great at not beating us over the head with that, while still letting the resonances speak for themselves. I mean, it's particular with the Crassus book a couple of years ago, given the nature of wealth and politics that Crassus embodied and what that meant for our present day. But in Horace, he sets himself the challenge of not just relating the poet's life and times, but of exploring and demonstrating what made Horace's poems special, how they worked, and why they last. Last week I had Cecile Wajsbrot and Tess Lewis on about Cecile's novel Nevermore, whose narrator was a translator trying to bring a segment of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse from English to French. And we got into the depth of reading that's necessary for that and what it's like to try to convey that on the page. And Tess talked about what it was like trying to bring that back into English, which is also a meta layer on top of it. Peter goes deep on Horace and the poems without being pedantic, but showing us what he was doing with Latin and bringing it into a flowing English. And he really brings out how Horace was trying to help build a poetic tradition in his language by working through the verse modes of the Greeks, who were the big precursors for the Romans in some respects. And it is just fascinating to see how Peter brings that out while dovetailing those poems that he's sort of breaking up. He's dovetailing those into Horace's life itself. It's really an achievement. And beyond the structure and power of the verse and the tumultuous times that Horace lived through, Peter also brings us the personality of the poet throughout this book, the nature of an artist who an artist on a volcano who burned with the need for perfection and teetered on the edge in a way that we tend to attribute to like modernity and the Romantic era and what we think of artists, post-Enlightenment, I guess. Horace embodied all of that and understood all of that in himself and conveyed that to some of his readers. This book really opened my eyes. It is an absolute wonder, and I now have my copy of Horace's Odes set up next to the Robert Musil as my next potential morning reading thing. But anyway, go get Horace, Poet on a Volcano, out now from Yale University Press. Trust me, you will come away with a lot of different things, not just a biography of Horace or an understanding of Rome and the times, but a real take on what it means to make art in the world. Those caveats go. Peter brought up a project that he realized after is a little too early to discuss, so I kind of edited a part of that out, and we're just going to pretend he is writing The Key to All Mythologies, that book that Casaubon was supposed to be working on in Middlemarch, but it turns out he wasn't actually working on it, which is not to cast any aspersions on the project that Peter is up to. It sounds phenomenal. I wish I could tell you what it is, but I can't. But I'll intrude around one of those edits, and, you'll get what I mean. Also, his mic levels were a little low. I did my best to amplify and equalize all that stuff, but you may need to, lean into the monitor a little bit while you're listening. Oh, and here is the epigraph from Nietzsche about Horace that Peter cites near the beginning. It's from Twilight of the Idols. I was considering opening the book and reading it myself, but I had my contacts in, couldn't read text too closely. Anyway, here's Nietzsche. This mosaic of words where every piece, as sound, as place, as concept, radiates its power right and left and through the whole. This minimum in the size and number of signs, this maximum in the energy of the signs achieved. So that's Nietzsche on Horace. Here's Peter's bio from the book. Peter Stothard is a classicist, journalist, and critic. He is a former editor of the Times of London and of the Times Literary Supplement. His books include The Last Assassin, The Hunt for the Killers of Julius Caesar, Crassus, The First Tycoon, and Palatine, An Alternative History of the Caesars. And now, the 2025 Virtual Memories Conversation with Sir Peter Stothard. Tell me about focusing on Horace and writing about a poet instead of politicians/assassins, I guess.
Well, Horace ended up as a big public figure, and the distinction between a poet and a politician wasn't quite as clear to him and to his friends and to his other people around him as it would be to us. Julius Caesar fancied himself as a poet. Cicero fancied himself as a poet. I mean, they weren't all as respected as much as poets as they'd like to have been, but it was part of being a public person, because it was in some respects part of like rhetoric, like oratory. It's a way of controlling the story, persuading people to your way of thinking. And so, although we're here talking in Horace, an extraordinary artistic genius, just like Caesar and Cicero were great geniuses in their own way, they wouldn't have seen probably quite as much of a difference as we do.
Sure. Yeah, I get you. But still, you frame Horace as somebody who, we'll say, avoided the politics as best he could. Public figure, but one who, realizes he's caught on the wrong side at various times and, kind of was hoping for, if I can just find a patron, I'll be able to make the work and, make that, again, turning art into a personal thing in a way that maybe didn't exist prior. Which, again, I found fascinating. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is one of the things that he did. But it's always important, and I realized when I was doing this book, which is a biography, it is a critical study, because I see his biography through the clues that he's left in the poetry. And in some academic quarters, that's still quite a controversial thing to do. But that's what I was doing. So I was doing it through the poetry. But you do realize that, as I say, what a huge public figure he did actually become. And the poems in which he was a public figure were not the ones which, on the whole, his readers now like to read. I mean, there are actually like three kinds of Horace poems. I never quite thought of it quite like this, but the very political ones saying how marvelous peace is and how marvelous the emperor is and how lucky we are that he's there. The ones brutal sort of poems of sort of very alienated, sexual aggression and sort of vicious poems right at the beginning of his career when he came back from the war. And then there's the mass in the middle of very beautiful odes, which are the ones which British and German and American readers have always liked. But if you're doing a biography of a man, there's no point, even though some critics would like me to have done, just to focus on the odes that everybody knows and reminding them, how beautiful they are and how wonderful and how lucky we are to have them. You've got to look for Horace in the brutal start that he made to his writing life, and what some people would have seen as a rather sycophantic end to it. And they all actually fit together into a single person much better than many people would expect.
How much did that model occur to you beforehand? How much of it emerged in the course of the research and writing? Because it feels very much like an organic, integrated self that you're building out of the poems and the times. I just wonder, did you go in with this is how to tackle him, or did some of that start to emerge over time?
Yes, I went in with that idea, and because I'd had so many, sometimes quite bitter arguments with other with particular sort of experts in Horace or Latin poetry, who, if you talk to them about a particular poem and you say, this suggests, that he did this or they kind of laugh at you, because they've all been deep dyed in sort of French theories, which say that the text is the only thing. There is no writer. Let alone not only is no writer you can find, but there isn't one in the first place. And so I was always quite hostile to this. It seemed to me that Horace, Horace leaves more clues to his life and tells us more about his life than any writer until, St. Augustine does a bit, but apart from St. Augustine, nobody else till Petrarch comes close. So if you say we can't say anything about Horace's life from his poetry, then you're cutting yourself off from any sort of biography, any attempt to get close to a writer, for 1,400 years, which is quite a high price to pay.
Yeah. It put me in mind of the end of the book, spoiler alert, where you kind of explore Horace's literary reputation over the 2,000 years and how he's been interpreted on and off, and how the past 50 years, you sort of have him frame him as having fallen out of favor, or at least, into, well, we'll say fallen out of favor / disrepute. How much of that do you ascribe to that, growth in theory versus the, I don't want to say cancel culture, but the vibe of, if an artist is not an absolutely perfect human being, we have to discount everything they've done?
Yeah, there is a bit of cancelling, but a lot of the cancelling took place for Horace quite a long time ago. We can't be too
Sure.
critical of our own cancel culturists in this respect, because as soon as the great teachers of Latin got hold of the text of Horace, we're talking now, thousands of years ago, not long after he died, they got hold of it, and they decided this was marvellous for teaching. So they immediately stripped away all the ones that were with dubious sort of sexual schemes, and they only focused really on the stuff that was suitable for sort of schoolboys, when it was only boys pretty much in those days. Sure. So although subsequently he has suffered from, like every Latin poet, from the fact that he lived in a slave culture, that he had slaves, the fact that he'd actually been the father of a slave himself and was heavily influenced by that, does not necessarily save you. In fact, it can make people think, if you don't like someone who's ever owned slaves, then the fact that your father was a slave doesn't necessarily make that better. It can sometimes make it worse. So yes, he has suffered, like everybody, from that, and of course he suffered a lot in he was, all pagans have suffered in the Christian culture for being not being Christian. Although Christian culture did try and sort of steal one or two poets and make them Christian, but nobody ever did that with Horace.
Yeah. Talk about your introduction to Horace. You allude to the 1960s education. And how it went, but talk about when you first encountered him and how he grew in your estimation.
I guess my first encounter, I didn't even know who he was. When I started at my sort of secondary school, if you like, it was a rather ambitious secondary school. It wasn't necessarily a great one, but it was, like a lot of English schools, they had a rather, and Americans too, they had a rather sort of fancy badge, a sort of crest that you had to wear on your jacket. And on the bottom of this crest, it said Incipe, and which is straightforwardly in Latin just means begin. Mm-hmm. And after I'd been doing Latin for a little bit, I remember asking the Latin teacher, why are we all walking around with begin on our jacket pockets? And he hadn't got the faintest idea. Not an idea, because those are the days before Google. You couldn't just put a Latin quote into your computer and and find out that Incipe came from Horace's letter to Lollius, offering him a kind of a reading list. You had to actually know it, and this guy didn't. And And Inkipe is part of what became a very important poem for Horace, because it's the one that Kant picked up too, which with the line "Sapere aude," it mean dare to learn. Incipe, begin to dare to learn. It was a sort of challenge to this guy Lollius, who was probably a bit of a sort of lazy student, to get a good reading list going. Work hard, get started, and don't hang around and wait for the perfect day to start your essay. Get on with it, which is obviously why it was on the badge of later. But not a single person knew that, and when I started reading Horace more later on, you realise that he had suffered from this to an extraordinary degree. I mean, he was an absolute brand tub for anybody who wanted a good phrase. And so a lot of his most famous phrases were just literally ripped out of his poems, used completely out of context, often stuck on cap badges and school badges, but everywhere. Wine labels, carpe diem. One of the most famous of his quotes, is plastered over every beer bottle in Nicaragua. No, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the beer of Nicaragua, but you get my meaning.
I believe it. We've seen it in enough other things in life, including the wine mom's, house decorations and such. So, along with seize the glass, but well, I'm going to ask your favorite translator of Horace, and what you learned translating him for the book, which is all a big, broad way of saying, how do you approach translating Horace and, Latin in general?
I'm not a translator. I make no claims.
Yeah.
I make it very clear in the book, but I was very nervous, really, of putting basic translations by me in the book, particularly at the back, because I think it's really important. I'm a biographer and a critic, and I'm not a poet, and I'm not a translator, and it's not something I feel that's what I do. What I was attempting to do in the body of the book was, it seemed to me very important, if you're writing a biography, a personal history of a poet, is to get as close as possible to the process of writing and how it sounded, how he made it sing, how he made the words fit together. Because for Horace, this is, as Nietzsche pointed out, and as I put at the beginning,
epigraph or epigram. I always screw that up. Yeah,
epigraph. But these great odes of Horace, the bit, the middle work, which as we were saying earlier, is what everybody wants to read, are extraordinary works of verbal poetic engineering. Horace had this extraordinary ability, a completely unique ability at that time, to use the Latin language to create this sort of cross between a sort of mosaic and a really intricate watch, where every bit hangs together and supports the other bit, even though it's a long way away from it. And once you now, really what you have to do is to get on top of the Latin and feel this and see this and understand it, even if you only do 2 or 3 poems. Now, I mean, there are some great translators who've attempted to do this. I mean, including some extraordinary Americans. I mean, David Ferry, I think, is probably one of the greatest. Only recently died. One of the greatest translators of Horace, and they have others, but they all have to deal with a problem which, to some extent, didn't interest me so much, or is not relevant to this particular book, which is that Horace was very alien to the people who first read him. So what is very, very familiar to us, carpe diem, is almost a cliche. They're all cliches. In medias res is a cliche. I mean, there are so many of these, the famous nunc est bibendum is a cliche. All these, but when they were written and when they were put together in these poems, not only were they not cliches, though some of them were borrowed from Greek poems, so they were borrowings, half borrowings. So it was a subtle business, but they were not familiar in Latin. But also they were very strange in Latin. And the one question for a translator, which to say it's not what I'm doing, is do you make it seem strange in English? Because in order to create the Milton, who's often described as one of the worst translators of Horace, was no fool, as you might imagine, and he did understand that actually it was the alien nature of the experience that was part of the experience of reading Horace in Latin, and he was interested in how you did that in English. But of course, it doesn't make it seem like a particularly good poem by Milton, this is. I mean, these are important issues for a translator, but it's not the reader who will read my book will I hope, be able, will get the Latin, will be able to read enough of the English will show how the Latin works in very short chunks. Yeah. Nobody needs to be frightened of this book. It takes the key elements, short pieces, and shows how they work for the creation of a poem. And if right from I really take apart what I think is the first poem that Horace ever did in some detail, reading it as a biographer, as though you were describing a footballer's first game, with quite a lot of detail as to what he actually did, and how he did it, how he threw the ball, I don't do that at all. It would be wearisome, but it was important that the reader gets the idea of the kind of thing Horace was doing. And I use the English to help that. I'm not trying to write beautiful translations, and there have been many of those, or many of them successful in different ways.
Yeah, and I found it fascinating, the literary, linguistic almost analysis embedding itself into the history and the memoir of it. It's funny, I have one copy of the Odes translated by James Mitchie, I guess. Yeah, and I was looking up poems that you were citing and trying to figure out, the translation. I had to look them up in the Latin there, and then came across, okay, this translator's doing a much more, we'll say, flowery, poetical translation of some of these lines, but I'm getting from Peter the mechanisms, like you say, the showing how it fits together.
James Mitchie was a poet. I mean, a lot of the poets did make Horace seemed a lot more flowery and much more the kind of poet they wanted Horace to be. So every translator did that. I mean, whether it's Swift or Pope or politicians. I mean, we were very keen on translating Horace. William Gladstone, our great 19th century prime minister, he published a translation of all the Odes, cutting out all the gay sex and all, or anything that even might look as though it was heading towards gay sex. They're pretty austere, focusing very much on the so-called Roman odes, the ones in praise of top politicians. As a top politician, he liked that. He liked that, and so the American president, John Quincy Adams, translated Horace too, in a rather strange. Well, the good rhyme that John Quincy Adams of quiver and liver, which makes a rather already slightly sort of plodding poem, rather mocking as well. But anyway, lots of people have a go at it, and they normally don't go at it for their own reasons. My aim in this, and people have written about his life the same. If they're clergymen and of a certain kind, they want him. They don't want to learn about the stuff that doesn't appeal to clergymen or shouldn't.
We'll say the more secular, as it were. Yeah. Now, how do your this will sound weird. We talked a few years ago for your book on Crassus, who. His story obviously weaves its way through Horace's. How do you feel your histories build on each other? I mean, you've got a basis of knowledge of everything. Do you feel there's a degree to which they kind of compound in the writing of each one?
Yes, it's hard. You've got to be careful. I think it's true. Crassus's defeat at Carrhae, and particularly the march of Crassus's army towards Carrhae was something would have been a big thing in Horace's childhood. And when I was writing about Horace at that time, am I exaggerating that point because I know a lot about Crassus, or am I pointing out that it's important, which someone who didn't know as much about Crassus might miss? I mean, I like to think I didn't distort Horace's story because of what I learned or knew about other people. I like to think I didn't do that, but I mean, somebody might say, yes, there's a bit more Crassus in this than there would have been if you hadn't just written a book about him. That might be fair. But then Crassus was a very important figure who in many traditional stories just becomes like the third wheel for Caesar and Pompey, and nobody really realised what an extraordinary figure he was at the time. So I think I'm being fair to Crassus, and I think Horace would have been absolutely aware of Crassus's march and the impact of his failure, because that was a big shadow over the Rome of his time.
And as far as the histories in general, I mean, you're writing on Roman history with the tangents and threads that empire has. That sense that one upon another they feed into each other.
Yeah, I do believe.
Do your books feel like a progression, I guess?
Yeah, and I am actually.
Okay, here's the part where he starts talking about the new project, which, again, we'll codename the Key to All Mythologies.
Poetry as a thread through a Roman history is an important thread, an important way of telling what is a very, can be a very complex story. I'm not so much personally interested in military tactics, and political intrigue is absolutely essential part of a story. Poetry was one of the things that distinguished the Roman Empire and the moment from others at that time. And when you try and get to the end, say, once you get to like 400 AD, and Rome is just another. In fact, Rome barely matters at all, and it's just people who call themselves the Roman emperors fighting Vandals and Goths and people. And you think, well, all of whom, incidentally, by then are Christians. So they're basically all Christians fighting each other, with bases in different parts of Central Europe. And you wonder, well, hang on, what was so special about Rome? Just another one of these guys fighting. But the literature, as a window into understanding what that culture was unique to Rome amongst those ones. We don't have an extensive Vandal literature or Gothic or literature of Goths, and what the Gauls were writing at that time, we don't know. And the Germans, I mean, I suppose some critics these days would say, hang on, they were doing wonderful things, but the Romans destroyed it all. I'm frankly a bit suspicious of that, but you can't be certain, I guess. But that is, we've got the Roman literature, we've got it as a window into the culture, and it is some of it is absolutely extraordinary and totally had so much impact on our own culture, and it's a window that we don't have into others. And as a historian, we use it as much as I can.
What's interesting to me, and I forget if we talked about this last time, I think we did. I came up, my graduate school, Great Books education was at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, and they're very Athens-centric to the point at which I somehow developed this sense of Rome as the pale copy of the Athenians and what they were doing. And that lasted decades until I revisited St. John, sat down with one of my tutors from there when I was in for a seminar, and he explained that I really needed to read Virgil and Livy and everything else. And in the process had I was full of it back when I was 25 years old. I didn't understand, the flowering of this, and the institution at St. John's was, again, very Greek-centric.
Yeah, well, important reasons for that, and also important implications. Because if you were interested, say, in treating democracy, that as a theory, you like to begin a story of democracy because you had this very, very brief period of direct democracy in Athens. It was less than a century. But but the fact that it was basically democracy was a great failure didn't stop people wanting to be, just to see what lessons we can learn and how important it was, and to sort of somehow link the democratic reforms that we were trying to have later, give them some special oomph and some special sort of status by linking them to the Greeks. Whether this was a helpful or historically appropriate thing to do was students tended not to be taught that. It was just that Greek period, and Greeks always did good. That's one of the things you learn rapidly when you become a Roman historian, is that if two armies invade Sicily, the Greeks civilize it. The Greeks, bring letters and art and were a civilizing influence. The Romans invaded it and turned it into a slave plantation. From the point of view of the Sicilians or anywhere else at the time, whether you were being civilized by a Greek or turned into
subjugated
by the Romans, may not have been anywhere near anything like as different as the people of Annapolis might have liked to think.
Yeah, sure feels the same. Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting. What I was getting to, though, was that sense of Virgil has a nation-building project with the Aeneid, where Homer doesn't. I always likened it to Michael Jordan versus Kobe Bryant, that Kobe was great, but he patterned everything on Michael Jordan and kind of fell within those parameters. But finally reading it, I realized, there's an actual project that the poem is serving, in a sense that maybe Homer doesn't have, because the nation of Greece doesn't exist as such back then. And seeing how the other poets, as you characterize them, Horace's contemporaries, and the sense in which they're building a poetic tradition and building a national identity,
and the politics
in the process,
the
is
politics
great.
Becomes very, very controversial. It depends whether you approve of the political project. Really, I mean, if you approve of the political project, then you like the fact that Virgil is and Horace too. We're building it. They were sort of state builders and helping Augustus to heal and to found a new Roman state. If you approve of that project, or if you think that you would like to have one of those yourself, like a lot of the British teachers of Latin in the 19th century, you liked Virgil and Horace, that part of it, for that reason, because Roman Empire, British Empire. Virgil, us, I mean, it was all kind of very convenient. If, however, you take the view that you're against that kind of thing, you're more likely to, if you're going to stick with Horace, you cut out all those bits, as I said, and you just do the poems that aren't political. If you're Virgil, you cut out, you concentrate, as a lot of school boys and girls, whoever teaches at school, I'm thinking back in my time, you concentrate on things like the fourth book of the Aeneid and the romantic stuff with Dido and Dido and Aeneas and Carthage, which is like a sort of romantic story, and you don't do the war in Italy, which is not so. I mean, most people say was probably not so good, but it also fits in with a project that you possibly don't want to engage with. And that was particularly problem at the time of Greek independence and the last part of the 19th century, when it was very fashionable amongst sort of intellectuals, to be very pro Greece, because they were anti-Turk, and they wanted Greece to be free, and that idea went up right up until the end of the Second World War. That you would make decisions on the basis that you were, pro-Greeks because Greece had founded democracy. I mean, Winston Churchill was I'm afraid, very vulnerable to that, and so were a lot of people. So it became a particular kind of Greek politics entered the argument, and also a particular kind of imperial Roman politics entered the argument, and it depended on which one you happen to like, would be which ones you would stress in the poems of antiquity.
Yeah, again, all these tensions were not occurring to me when I was, fresh out of my undergrad years and seeing how this stuff was playing out in the education. But again, seeing, especially the way you frame it in this book in particular, it becomes much more meaningful, I'll say, that the understanding of the role that art or the poetry was playing within what it meant to become Rome, and what it meant to again, like I was saying, try to create a poetic tradition, which they're still developing. And it ties back to that question of translation, because one of the things you really get at deftly is what it meant for Horace to adapt Greek meters and poetic styles into Latin. And again, the alienness of that, because it's something that when we see people try to translate Homer with that hexameter that they were, it just doesn't work in English. So that question of, how he manages to do this, sort of bridging those traditions and making it something that becomes Roman in the process. Again, I think you convey it really well. And I was just fascinated by that theme running throughout the book in terms of, where the poem structures were coming from for him.
Well, that's why in the book I had to try and explain how he did that, how he did that, and what his methods were in that, because that's what he says he's most proud of, and indeed his transformation. I mean, he didn't translate, but he did transform. I mean, these Greek poems into Latin was what propelled the two together. Propelled literary art into the Renaissance. I mean, it was very strange that when Rome fell and things were falling apart, and we had what became known as the Dark Ages, if they were or not discussed. But the literature went west. And the science and the stuff that's less literary all went east, and so and the buildings, the only buildings we left were the ones in Africa. So you've got your sort of, I think, where the Roman legacy was divided into, the buildings are mostly knocked down in Europe. The buildings in Africa are good. The poetry very strong in the European tradition from the Italian Renaissance, and we weren't so much interested then in the medicine and the science, though some very intelligent people in the East and Near East were.
Yeah. I did, by the way, finally get to Rome last fall. I'd never been, but I had a trade show in Milan, so my wife and I spent a few days in Rome first, did a nice tour, the Colosseum and the Forum and everything. So I now have some context for all of this in terms of actually walking around and seeing the space. So,
of course, if you're familiar with Athens, you realize that, I mean, how Rome is now much more complicated, because purely for nationalistic state building reasons, the early Greek government in the mid 19th century knocked down pretty well everything around in the middle of Athens, all the ruins that weren't 5th century Greece. So they created a notion that Athens was basically the Athens of Pericles, because the Athens of everybody else, the Romans and Christians and Turks, was kind of obliterated. Whereas in Rome, there is a continuous tradition. So you see churches built on top of ancient sites, and often only surviving, the site only surviving because it was turned into a church, like at the Pantheon. So everything is, and it's a bit more higgledy-piggledy. So it's harder to work out exactly what's going on, but it's a much more honest place, in my view, than Athens, which is basically a fake.
Yeah. I was floored at that sense of that. Again, the strata, I suppose, the way just generation upon generation is building there, and what they're discovering underneath. The resonances, I guess, of some of these places and what they meant. It's until you're there, you don't get it. Or at least in my case, it's something I got theoretically, and then walking around, I'm like, oh, okay, now this is multiple thousands of years, and it's.
But it's very exciting. There was one amazing. I mean, I think it was 1888. They were rebuilding a bit of the banks of the Tiber, and they came with this rock, which actually had on it the Quintus Horatius Flaccid Composuit. Quintus Horatius Flaccid composed this poem, and it's all about the celebrations of Augustus's great games of the century, for which Horace wrote a poem. And there are still some, cynical, really kind of theoretical people who say, how do we know any of this was ever true? How do we know that there ever was a Horace? How do we know? Okay, we got these poems, but I mean that's all we really got. Let's not pretend there's anything historical here whatsoever. There are some people who take these very extreme, to very great extremes, but there is some magic, as you say, when you talk about these layers. But sometimes the layers do not just produce something which is a building like one mentioned by Virgil or Horace or Vitruvius or whatever, but it actually says, has actually got the words, this was written by Quintus Horatius Flaccus, and you've got to be a really skeptic of skeptics to not see that this is a pretty magical piece of rock.
Were you ever, I'll say, tempted or sort of lured into that literary theory world, that death of the author thing, or were you pretty, well, that doesn't make sense from the beginning?
No, I wasn't. But then I was when
you became aware of it, I suppose.
When I was a classicist, and when I was, and it came late. That theory, that kind of approach, came quite late to the classics. I'm not saying it's just not done any good. There's a very good book called Horace Made New, which does by Charles Martindale, which does approach Horace through many of these theoretical positions, which are by no means worthless. I mean, no one should misunderstand me. I'm not saying you can't learn anything from this theory. It's just that it should not blank out and dominate and erase the possibilities of biography and history from an informed and sensitive, close reading of poems. I mean, I may have got some interpretations wrong, and others may have. I mean, the notes in this book. I was pleased to say one of the reviewers said that the notes were worth the price of the price of the book, because there's quite a lot of effort went into because the notes are about argument. The biographical text is a narrative, but the notes are about the arguments about the text, and I hope they are a good read, and they do. And lots of people therefore have different interpretations as to where Horace was. Was he at the Battle of Actium, which was the main battle that was decisive for Octavian, or wasn't? You could read the poems either way, and people have. So I'm not, there's plenty of room to disagree, but where there isn't room, in my view, is to say that none of it matters at all.
Yeah. And again, the way you show the poems are writing at the personal in a way that poets weren't doing back then. It certainly seems like that was his intent, to create a persona of Horace also. Yes. And you have the great self-promotion / social media of his time, things that he was doing to promote his collection when it was coming out. But,
yeah,
given how much all of us have to do that with social media. Yeah.
Yes, something of that. I mean, because he came from a very poor background, and took a long time before he had any sort of status of any sort. Not only from a poor background, not only was his father had been a slave, probably not for very long, but his father had been a slave. And because he'd fought on the wrong side in a civil war, he had to be pretty careful, and he wasn't. Whereas Catullus, say, of an earlier generation, was from a grander background to start with, was very much a player in the kind of fast set of Roman time. wasn't so inhibited, and was able to express himself, I think, a bit more openly and clearly because of the status that he had, which Horace never had really, and even when it was available to him, I don't think really wanted.
There's something you wish we had of Horace's? Some, biographical fact that would have kind of solidified something for you, or you satisfied with, what there was and what you're able to put together from it.
I think of all the gaps in antiquity, that we have when you're writing history or biography, we would be greedy to want more of Horace. Yeah. Of course, there are things that we would like to know. I would like to know whether he was at the Battle of Actium or not. I don't think he was, but it would solidify that particular bit of the text if I knew for certain that he was or wasn't. But given how little we know, you can't write a biography of Lucretius because literally, we haven't got anything, so one shouldn't be greedy. I think we should be very grateful for what we have of Horace. Though, of course, there would be some gaps that would be nice to fill, but nothing like the gaps that there are in the life of Virgil. So.
Yeah. I will say, as far as weird resonances go, I wrote about this in my newsletter over the weekend, but a huge tree crashed down in my yard earlier last week, and I had coincidentally left for a trade show a few hours before. Otherwise, at a minimum, my car would have been smashed underneath it. Conceivably, given the amount of time I spend walking around my yard, I could have been crushed under this tree. So reading your take on Horace, the tree, and the poetry that inspired from not getting hit by it, but speculating as to what would have happened had you been crushed by a tree. I found some interesting moments for myself in the middle of reading the book.
Yeah, I don't think anyone of the most skeptical kind has ever thought that Horace wasn't nearly killed by a tree. I mean, they've said that his pulling out of that event in his life represents, and I think that's true, other near misses that he had. So when it was, it was quite difficult to talk about his role at the Battle of Philippi because he was on the wrong side, and people might misunderstand. And so he does actually talk about Philippi, but you sometimes feel that when he's talking about and there were other near misses in his life. I mean, life was very, very hazardous then as now, but more hazardous. And there many times, but he had some pretty near misses. And the tree, when he refers to the tree quite often, I think it's because that's a way of focusing his mind on.
Oh, I'll be milking that one for myself. That's okay. I have to say, well, if I was out there 2 hours earlier, boom. That's,
and if you don't want to talk about that time when you were driving too fast and nearly crashed, which has been embarrassing.
Simon Critchley brought that up in our last conversation. He brought up a near death that was really his fault, but but it was transformative for him. So that's okay.
It's much better to use poetry Yeah, I'm sure the technical term for that, I forget exactly what it is. Some transference of some sort.
Now, one of the things we talked about last time, and something that Horace really focuses on, you and I have each faced down our mortality, you more significantly than I. In Horace's case, the understanding and knowledge that whatever his mortal state is, these poems are going to be the monument and the lasting treasure that exceeds him in generation after generation. How do you think about legacy in art and your legacy in terms of what you've made? And I know neither of us are Horace. We're not making things that are going to last 2,000 years, but how much do you consider that sense of legacy in what you make?
I think I'm passing on the legacy of a man who has an extraordinary confidence of that his work would last. It is. I could still never ever climb up Capitol Hill, which is now rather different. We climb in from and from the back to go up to the church, and go up to the Capitoline Museum. But every time I do that, I still think, that Horace says, "I will survive as long as the priest with the Virgin is climbing the Capitol." And quite often you do see a nun and a priest, climbing up there. And okay, they're different kind of priests and different kind of virgins, maybe, but not that different. And the sense that this was a boast, that Horace's boast turned out to be true, is, if you don't like the person, you think, God, that's very irritating. But the point about Horace is that he's a friend. He doesn't have the answers. No one should ever read Horace. They've tried to defend a particular position or to argue a particular case. If you read Horace, all of Horace, properly, as I'm encouraging, selections of Horace from different periods, you really get to feel that this man is a kind of friend of yours and a good thing. And therefore the notion that something good, for all the fact that he lived in a slave society and was exploitative of women and all the things that he did that, supported an imperialist regime. And although he was involved in all sorts of things that now a lot of people find, rightly, not always rightly, but quite often rightly, distasteful, doesn't alter that he was a really good guy. And therefore the fact that he survived and that his boast of surviving, his boast of using art for survival turned out to be justified and true is very, very powerful to me, leaving aside everything else.
Yeah, you remind me of Orwell writing about Henry Miller and the voice of Tropic of Cancer, how it's a friendly voice guiding you through that Paris of that time, that it's somebody you could sit down and spend an evening with and end up getting into crazy amount of trouble, but somebody you spend an evening with and yeah, that's well, again, you opened my eyes to Horace with the book in general, but do you have a favorite poem of his?
The poem I often come back to is maybe it's just the fact that I'm a journalist and a descriptive writer rather than is the so-called Satire 1.5, the Journey to Brindisium, where Horace describes effectively a diplomatic journey with Maecenas and Virgil and other poets on Octavian's side, negotiating with Antony. And it's the most brilliant bit of art. Anybody who's writing a short story or has got, who should, can really learn from this in the way you get into a story at the right point, get out of it at the right point. Don't laden it with extraneous stuff that doesn't really matter. Horace was a genius at the construction of that kind of poetic narrative. There's another poem, a sort of courtroom poem, about a sort of courtroom spat on the way to the Battle of Philippi, which is also, whatever you think of the content, it's this technique is absolutely brilliant. Now, I also of course, I love the deep and powerful poems of De Figure Nives, the one that Haussmann called the most beautiful poem in of all antiquity, and you can everyone should read that and may or may not find a tear. That extraordinary sense that doesn't seem quite so, maybe not so decisive to us, that nature encircles itself all the time. So nature, that spring full of summer, trees, empty trees full of leaves, rivers ice up and de-ice, but that man only goes one way. When nature goes around in a circle, we just go straight. And Horace has a number of beautiful poems that I think are many people's favourites, and I would and I love them, of which De Figure Nives is perhaps the most uncommon. But you asked me for my favourites, and I'm going to go for the satire, the Journey to Brindisium, and what happens to Horace when the girl he's expecting to arrive in his bed doesn't turn up.
Which I found funny because you allude to what happened, at one point, and then clarify a little bit later, just because I was wondering whether his response was deliberate or accidental. We'll put it that way. But yeah, that was entertaining as your way of approaching the poems and what it was like to be living through those moments. But so sort of over question, since this is what happens to people who come on a second time for the show. It's been about 2.5 years since we sat down. What's changed? How has life evolved? Or how are you different than when we spoke in October of 2022?
That's a kicker, hard one, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. It's either that or I ask you what you've been reading lately, and we'll get to that afterwards.
What am I? I'm more anxious about the United States of America than I was then.
Join the club.
I'm happier in myself, though I was very happy when I saw you last time. But I'm feeling happier even than before that I'm no longer editing a great newspaper. I think as every year goes by, and every year that we move into this world which is so difficult. I mean, so impossible for journalists. I think I don't know whether my colleagues are exaggerating or minimizing the dangers that the United States are. I literally don't know. Nobody knows, but I have a feeling that if anything, they're minimizing them. I think the dangers might be greater than we think. But I'm glad I don't have to make those calls, and I'm not editing a newspaper. And I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah. Oh, I'll off mic. I will tell you some stories from my Washington-related job, which this podcast helps keep me from thinking about too much, which is a good thing. But I want to thank you for Horace, and for opening my eyes. I mean, I have a copy of the Odes, like I said, but never really dived in. So, now I'm going to be spending my time with James Michie and you've also mentioned.
Try the epodes. Try the epodes and the satires and we didn't even talk about the extraordinary Ars Poetica, the book, the poem that for many people was Horace's most important poem. That was complete. It really does show what a madman on a volcano he was. But and people should take an open-eyed view of that one too. Anyway, I hope people enjoy the book.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, and we're about to fall away from an outro of this, but that sense of how modern Horace was, and he was modern in his time, of course, because he was contemporary, but the modernity that he encompassed, that sense of the madman artist. There are those moments where we realize classical times had a lot of things that carry over to our present, I guess.
Yeah, and a lot of things that we have obliterated from the classics because they haven't fitted in with our ideas. And Horace was indeed a wild character in many ways, and was not an English clergyman or an English general or a Roman or an American president. He was a wild guy, and whose ideas of perfection. I mean, it wasn't just the immortality. I mean, immortality was like a boast, but he had a notion of the perfection of what he was trying to create, and he talked in the way that people, many French writers and others of what you do if you don't meet up the standards of the perfection that you're seeking. And that's why he's the poet on the volcano, that he's considering killing himself or behaving like a madman because he can't live up to, or he no longer wants to aim for the perfection that that people don't even know he's not meeting. That he can see the failures and they can't, and that they think he's mad. And this is an aspect. This would have been very. Someone like Cyril Connolly would have completely understood this as a poetic state of mind, but it's not the way people often think of the staid classics. Yeah,
and again, it's an eye-opening book for me. So, Peter, I want to thank you for coming on the show again. I promise next time we'll be at your place and sit down and maybe take a trip on the river again and. Share some conversation.
I look forward to that very much. Good luck to you.
And that was Peter Stothard. Go get Horace, Poet on a Volcano, out now from Yale University Press. It's so good. I will admit, I'm kind of bummed we didn't get to record this one in person, because I think we would have gone longer and more in depth and really explored that romantic / modern notion of the artist that Horace was getting at more than 2,000 years ago. But we're going to save that for our next conversation about the key to all mythologies. Now, Peter doesn't have a website, but he is on Blue Sky, where he goes as Peter-Stothard, and that's Peter-Stothard. I'll have a link to that and to his books in the show and episode notes for this one. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.